Shalom and welcome to Israel Policy Pod. I'm your host, Shanie Reichman, the Director of Strategic Initiatives and IPF Atid at Israel Policy Forum. I'm joined here by Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor at Israel Policy Forum. We're going to cover a lot of internal drama within Israel today regarding the judiciary. I know everyone really missed this from early 2023, so we're back at it. And then, of course, the renewed offensive in the Gaza Strip. So back to our usual war-related programming. How's it going, Neri?
Hi, Shanie. Personally doing okay. The sun is shining. Spring is in the air. Passover is around the corner. But as you alluded to, this is like Back to the Future. We're back to October 6th, 2023, with the domestic crisis here in Israel, in the middle of a war, no less. So it's all a bit maddening and angering and a bit depressing.
Okay, on that note, let's start with the internal. Okay, so the judicial overhaul plan is back. There were votes in the Knesset last week, on the system to appoint judges in Israel. Of course, some of us remember this controversial bill from 2 years ago when it faced major opposition in the Israeli public. What are the implications of this bill, Neri? And I'm wondering if you would also add, are we going to see a bunch more? Because the judicial overhaul plan initially was very, very extensive, and there were a variety of components of it. So I'm wondering if we're going to see more of this.
So the short answer is yes. The judicial overhaul, this was the flagship of this current Netanyahu government when it first came into power in 2023. This was the reason for the 9 straight months of mass protests all across Israel every week. As we all know, the largest protest demonstration in Israeli history, right up until October 7th, 2023. And then the war hit. Just terrible, terrible moment in Israeli and Jewish history. But it did have, I hate to call it a silver lining, but it did actually shelve the judicial overhaul issues of wartime exigencies and military strategy took precedent. You have to remember there was also a national unity wartime government. Benny Gantz and his party came in, and one of the stipulations was we're only focusing on the important things and not these divisive issues. That seems like a lifetime ago, and it was, a year ago that they still had a national unity government, but now the Netanyahu government, as I'm sure many of our listeners know, is back to its old playbook. First and foremost, the judicial overhaul, really changing the very tenets, the very foundations of Israeli democracy, as Dan Maridor on last week's episode laid out very eloquently and very strongly. And yes, one of the big planks of the judicial overhaul was this committee that appoints judges here in Israel. And this is not a minor point. And we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, Tel Aviv time. So this morning, the Knesset passed into law major changes to how judges are appointed in Israel. First and foremost, Supreme Court judges. And this will, I won't get into the weeds of it, but long story short, it gives the politicians essentially control and veto power over who becomes a judge in Israel. And you compare this to the system, for the past 7 decades here in Israel, where it's much more professional, not politicized. The judges and the Bar Association, the lawyers, had major input and, dare I say, veto power over who became a judge. And you didn't just leave it to the politicians, which, politicians all over the world, not the greatest in this day and age. But in Israel, I dare say it's even worse than that. And so this was a major, major point of emphasis for the Netanyahu coalition and Justice Minister Yariv Levin from the Likud party. And so they managed to pass this morning. And there was opposition on the streets and outside the Knesset as the vote was going on. 10,000, maybe more protesters, but not at the scale that we saw back in 2023. And we can maybe get into the reasons why. And that's the bad news. The good news, and again, a silver lining, if you can call it that, is that this bill that they actually passed to actually overhaul and reform the judge appointment committee, as it's called here, wasn't as hardline as what they wanted to pass back in 2023. So for one thing, they delayed implementation of the law and the kind of change to the committee till after the next election, till after the next Knesset. That's important because the opposition has already vowed that if, and hopefully when, they win the next election, the first thing they'll do is pass a law kind of annulling in unwinding the law that was passed this morning. And also, in terms of the actual details of the law, it does provide some, shall we say, parity between the government and the opposition in terms of finding consensus, or if you can't find consensus, then each one picking their own judges. So again, it's softer than what they initially wanted to pass. But again, the process, if this actually comes into law and is implemented in the next Knesset, the way judges are appointed here in Israel is going to be a lot more political, dare I say, maybe more resembling the process in America as it's come to be known. And that's probably not a great thing for the professionalism of the courts and really the high court, the Supreme Court. And the crux of it all is that the Netanyahu government wants to go after the levers of power, the institutions, the gatekeepers, as they're known here, that tell them no, right? That constrain the power of the government, of the executive, because some things they want to do are either illegal or unconstitutional. So this is the crux of it. This is the reason why they're going after the judges and the Supreme Court. This is the reason why they're going after the Attorney General, the head of the Shin Bet. They've already taken over the police in many respects. So this is where we're at once again. Back to the future.
Well, all of that is it's definitely giving me some deja vu from the massive protest movement that we saw in Israel back 2 years ago. But you mentioned that it's not quite as strong a movement now. I wonder if it's being overshadowed by the constitutional crisis that is looming in Israel, as the government fired or tried to fire, Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar and the Attorney General, then declared that unconstitutional. Now the Israeli cabinet is seeking to fire that Attorney General. So what do we need to know about this whole, what seems to be a very crazy situation? I'm wondering if that's part of why we're not seeing so much backlash around the judiciary plan.
So, well, we've talked about this, I think, in the past, right? The exhaustion of the Israeli public, the fact that less people are out on the streets than back in 2023 every week. Although there was a pretty big protest that I attended this past Saturday on Kaplan Street and Begin Street outside the IDF headquarters at Kiryat. And this was kind of an amalgamation of both anti-government protests, protesting against the intention, like you said, to fire the Shin Bet chief, Ronen Bar, and the Attorney General, and also demanding a hostage deal, and a lot of anger at the restarting of the Gaza war, which I'm sure we'll talk about in just a bit. So that was actually quite a large demonstration, especially given the past, 17, 18 months of war. But again, it's difficult. There is the exhaustion of the public. There is the demands on all of us here, but especially those who have served, say, in reserve duty. For some of them have served, 200 days, 300 days, 400 days over the past year and a half in uniform. And really, if we take a step back, just look at what's gone on here in Israel over the past, 6 years since 2019, Shanie? Like, you've had 5 straight elections, more or less, right? Many of them inconclusive. So you had repeat elections. That was something that never happened before in Israeli history, not by a long shot. You had COVID, the pandemic, and the lockdowns, like everywhere, but especially here. You had this kind of weird amalgamation, this two-headed prime ministership, just to keep Netanyahu kind of in power. That was first under Benny Gantz, and then Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid also managed that. You had the judicial overhaul in early 2023 and the mass protest movement that I mentioned, and October 7th, and this terrible, terrible day and event, this Black Saturday, followed by 17 months of war on multiple fronts. And that's just the past 6 years. So I don't blame people here from being a bit tired. But having said all that, it remains to be seen whether the public does come out. I think there will be a few triggers, and the bill that was passed this morning clearly wasn't one of them. But getting to the first part of your question, Ronen Bar. So Netanyahu fired him a number of days ago. And the Supreme Court, as it does in many cases, and this is what angers the government, said, hey, wait a minute, we need to review this. We need to make sure that they're followed due process. We need to make sure that there aren't conflicts of interest, because the Shin Bet is investigating Netanyahu's office, shall we say, and several of his aides for perhaps accepting money from Qatar, so-called Qatar Gate scandal. So Supreme Court essentially issued an injunction on Netanyahu actually removing Ronen Bar from the post. And they're going to hold a hearing on that on April 8th. So basically right up to the eve of Passover. So that's going to be a major day here. Netanyahu has started interviewing candidates to replace Ronen Bar, and the Supreme Court has allowed him to do that, but it doesn't allow him to actually replace him in practice until it comes before the court. So the real question, and this is the crux of the crisis constitutionally, is if the Supreme Court deems the firing of Ronen Bar to be unconstitutional, will the government, will Bibi Netanyahu actually accept the verdict and adhere to the Supreme Court decision? And there are people, senior ministers in Netanyahu's government, who said, no, we're not going to accept the verdict. And then you're in a constitutional crisis, right? Because just think about Ronen Bar, essentially legally, according to the court, still remaining Shin Bet chief. Netanyahu comes out and announces that X candidate, Puppet X, is now the new head of the Shin Bet, the domestic intelligence agency. What happens then? Does Puppet X need a police escort to go to Shin Bet headquarters in North Tel Aviv to get into the building, right? What will the Shin Bet guards at the entrance to the building do? Will Netanyahu order the police to go and arrest Ronen Bar? Because from the government's point of view, Ronen Bar is no longer Shin Bet chief, so what he's doing is illegal. Or will the Shin Bet and the Attorney General and the court issue order to the police to arrest Puppet X because he's not the real Shin Bet chief? So again, that's kind of the extreme case, but this is what's looming in terms of just the Shin Bet chief saga. And we'll be a lot smarter come April 8th, and we'll see how the Supreme Court decides. And, again, it also will depend how long it will take them to decide. And in the meantime, hopefully Netanyahu doesn't escalate and, he's interviewing candidates, but will he actually nominate someone to be Shin Bet chief? Because that will essentially violate the court order, and then we're in uncharted territory. So yeah, this is the real crux of the constitutional crisis. And by the way, I forgot to mention the law that they passed earlier today, to kind of reform and overhaul the judges appointment committee. It's already being appealed to the Supreme Court, so we'll have to see how the court decides on that issue. I find it hard to believe the court will kind of deem the law to be illegal or unconstitutional, but you never know. But on the issue of Shin Bet chief, I could very easily see them deciding against the government, and also the issue of the Attorney General, who it's kind of a longer time frame, but the government has already made clear that they want to fire her. The cabinet issued a motion of no confidence to remove Gali Barav-Miara, the Attorney General, from her post. That will take a bit more time. It's a bit more convoluted process. There's a kind of a standalone public committee that has to convene, 5-member committee made up of the justice minister and several other individuals. They have to fill this committee. That won't be easy. The government may try to pack it with its own people. That will also be appealed to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court will have to decide whether the government's appointments to this committee that will decide on whether Gali Barav-Miara can be removed, should be removed. So again, all roads lead to the Supreme Court, and we have to kind of wait patiently. But that will take a bit more time. The first step is the committee actually being convened, probably after Passover. They'll have to make a decision. The government will have to decide whether it will adhere to their decision, which isn't binding, and then we'll have to take it from there.
Have we had this sort of constitutional crisis in Israel before, or come close to it?
Not as close as this. I mean, we were pretty close in 2023 because there were moments where the government wanted to move ahead with certain legislation. Eventually, it did pass one piece of legislation, if you recall, in late summer, basically trying to undo what they call the reasonableness clause, essentially the power of the Supreme Court to review government decisions, including hiring and firing key civil servants, as being reasonable or unreasonable. I remember reporting outside the Supreme Court for CNN that September, because that was when the Supreme Court, the full panel of judges, took up the case. And they, if I remember correctly, they had to issue their decision in late October, basically, or basically later in the fall. Obviously, the war erupted. October 7th happened. And so the court kind of got lost in the shuffle for obvious reasons, but they issued their decision in January and basically deemed the law that they passed as unconstitutional. So we were pretty close in 2023, but this was the exact type of scenario that people feared, right? That the government would actually push the issue and push the envelope and go after, say, the key gatekeepers like the Attorney General, go after the judges. And even right now, there's a kind of low-level, low-boil constitutional crisis in the sense that the government doesn't recognize the legitimacy or even the existence of the newly appointed Supreme Court Chief Justice, the head of the court. They just don't recognize him because he was appointed according to the old process. So again, will that come into play? Remains to be seen. So there have been kind of moments like this, but not as forceful as the current moment. And you combine it with, how shall I put this? The rhetoric coming from the very top, coming from the prime minister. And he gave a speech yesterday, Wednesday, in the Knesset. And I urge people to check it out. He posted it with English subtitles on his Twitter account, essentially saying, we're going after the tyranny of the bureaucrats. We're going after the deep state. The essence of democracy is the will of the people. We represent the majority of the people, the nation, even though, according to every opinion poll, they don't. They're in the minority on nearly every issue that is important. But never mind. He's like, well, we have a mandate from the vast majority of the people. They're in our corner, and we're going after this select, shadowy, deep state cabal that thwarts the will of the people. If this sounds familiar, it should, but this is kind of the mood music in the background. Netanyahu doesn't seem too deterred from pushing ahead on these very issues, again, for political reasons here at home, and also maybe getting a backwind from places closer to your neck of the woods, Shanie.
Thanks for all of that context, Neri. Is there anything that can actually stop this government? Because, of course, they are the democratically elected government of Israel. And also, there is a vast majority of Israelis who are opposed to what they are doing, and there are people taking to the streets. So what could a potential future in which these sorts of moves didn't move forward and we avoided the constitutional crises, what would that look like? How would that happen?
I'm glad you asked that question. Maybe a bit of hopeful topics, hopeful news. Hope springs eternal, and I try to remain optimistic on all fronts on a daily basis, despite the torrent of more negative news that we're all subjected to. But I will say I am hopeful for a couple of reasons. Now, obviously, the government, the Netanyahu coalition, has a majority, and actually a strengthened majority in the Knesset, in Parliament, 68 seats in the 120-seat Knesset. So nobody's expecting anything from Parliament, from Knesset, either the members of Netanyahu's coalition finding their moral backbone. I think that ship has sailed. Nobody's expecting any miracles from them. And the opposition is a bit feckless and doesn't have the numbers, doesn't have the unity in its own ranks. And we're not really expecting much from them either. So we're looking at kind of extra parliamentary measures to try to force this government to back down. So what does that mean? More people on the streets, like back in 2023, would be a major, major move, and it remains to be seen. And again, we may have a trigger if he, say, like we said, pushes to actually remove Rodan Bar and appoint someone else. That could be a trigger. The whole issue of the Attorney General, that could be a trigger, or maybe something else that we don't see coming, maybe more in controversial and hardline legislation. That could be a trigger. Maybe the hostages, again, could be a trigger, like we saw last September, massive demonstrations when tragically the 6 hostages were killed in southern Gaza by Hamas. So again, mass protests is one thing. The opposition and some other groups here have threatened what they call kind of civil unrest, obviously nonviolent, but civil unrest. So we're talking about people refusing to pay taxes and kind of shutting down highways and airports and the like, maybe. The second avenue is the economy. So basically, we've already seen and heard reports of the big trade union, the Histadrut, and the private sector kind of forum, the big companies in the private sector, the big companies in the tech sector, already meeting and talking amongst themselves and being like, okay, what would be the trigger for us to go on general strike, right? And this is something that they did back in 2023 when Netanyahu tried to fire then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and there was a massive general strike the day after, and it shut down the country, and Netanyahu had to backtrack. So that's a real thing, and the thinking is that they won't pull the trigger on a general strike unless the government actively violates a Supreme Court order, i.e., they refuse to recognize the authority of the court. That could be big if they can actually get a general strike and shut down the country. Add to that, universities, colleges, local governments, local councils, that kind of thing also will join a general strike and probably take to the streets. And then the third thing, the gatekeepers, the court. If the court itself stands up to the government and also the attorney general, that could also be key, because again, we don't necessarily know how the court will rule, so they also have to make their own decisions and issue a verdict on these and other issues that are coming down the pike. So those, I think, are the three hopes that we have. Remains to be seen.
A lot to look forward to on that front. Moving
on the
beyond
on the eve of Passover, right?
Yep.
Exactly.
That'll be some pretty eventful Seder conversations across Israel.
Yeah. If
unless, I mean, some families have banned politics from the Pesach table. I don't know if your family's one of them, but
yes, that is a resounding yes. And I know other similar families who, well, hopefully they don't bring up politics if there are major divisions and differences of opinion around the Pesach table or any table. But yes, it could be it will likely be a major point of conversation, shall we say, this Passover. Okay, we'll be right back after this brief message.
Israel Policy Forum is a policy organization rooted in the Jewish community. Our mission is to build support for a secure, Jewish, democratic Israel through a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, advancing pragmatic U.S. policy towards the conflict, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional diplomacy among policymakers and community leaders. We promote policy measures endorsed by credible security experts, develop analysis and commentary, and convene programs that engage and educate leaders across the political, denominational, and generational spectrums. Our Young Professionals initiative, IPF Atid, works to elevate the discourse among next-generation leaders by building community and facilitating engaging programs related to Israeli-Palestinian affairs. To learn more about our work, visit us online at israelpolicyforum.org and follow us on social media. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a tax-deductible gift today at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
Moving to our more typical focus, I suppose, which is on the war in Gaza, where the IDF has begun a renewed offensive as of last week. What is the IDF's plan, if there is a plan, as it renews the fighting against Hamas? And how does it impact what to me is really the most important question here, which is releasing the remaining hostages who are still in captivity? How do they fit into whatever plan or lack thereof exists right now?
So I'll give you the government and military position, and then I'll give you the criticism of the government and military position. So basically the government, Israel, because it's represented by the government, renewed the offensive against Hamas in Gaza, was it last Tuesday, with the massive airstrikes that we saw. And then they followed that up in more recent days by, it's a renewed ground offensive, but very slow, methodical, and kind of pinpoint. So not a full-scale renewed ground offensive like we saw, say, in late October 2023, at least not yet. So the ceasefire is done. The ceasefire has collapsed. Israel and this government has said that they're not willing to halt the war and halt the offensive until Hamas releases hostages. And we can get into what that may look like in a second, and that they're only going to negotiate under fire. The airstrikes and the offensive won't stop unless Hamas actually releases hostages. And negotiations won't suffice this time around. So that's what we're looking at, and it's been quite bloody, especially last week in Gaza, and it's heaping more pressure, obviously, on the people of Gaza, who have been through a lot over the past 18 months, and definitely heaping more pressure on Hamas. We also have to remember Israel, at the start of the month, shut off all humanitarian aid to Gaza at the very end of the first phase of the ceasefire deal. And there are maybe other plans in the works to increase that kind of pressure on Hamas. And this all has one objective that could work, or if it doesn't work, then Israel will, I believe, make good on its threat. The purpose right now, at least in the short term, is to get Hamas to cave. And I've said this in previous podcasts. Essentially, there's a, behind the headlines, in the shadows, negotiation still ongoing, which is stalled, but there's still a negotiation ongoing through the mediators, the U.S. and Egypt and Qatar, to get Hamas to essentially cave and release at least, Israel is demanding 11 live hostages. The Trump administration, depending on the day, may suffice with 5 live hostages, especially including Idan Alexander, the dual U.S.-Israeli national. And so basically Hamas has to make a decision. Is it willing to invite more and more pressure and more attacks by Israel, or is it willing to essentially cave and give up more hostages? And for right now, Hamas is sticking to its previous position that we know. It said, look, this was a deal we signed back in January. You promised us real negotiations and that the war wouldn't restart until we got a second stage of the ceasefire deal, meaning a Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, a permanent end to the war, and that would be the avenue to release, thinking is at least all the live hostages and maybe more. So that's what Hamas is still demanding. We're willing to release hostages if you end the war. And obviously, the Netanyahu government has a very different opinion, and in this, they're being backed by the Trump administration. So essentially, we're looking at coercive diplomacy against Hamas to see if it caves. Absent that, I do, like I said, take the Netanyahu government, prime minister on down, at their word. They're willing to, this time, go all the way and increase pressure. And I reported this with my colleagues in the Financial Times early this week, and our dear friend Amos Harel reported it for Haaretz late last week, so he gets first credit. There are plans already drawn up by the IDF to completely reconquer and reoccupy the Gaza Strip, right? And this is new. So essentially,
the entirety of the Gaza Strip?
Correct.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think that's a bluff. I mean, it would be a major operation for the IDF. It would be a tall hurdle, especially given the attrition and the burnout amongst a lot of the ground forces. But I don't think it's an empty bluff. Obviously it's meant to coerce Hamas to cave. So hopefully we don't reach that point. But absent that, I think this new IDF general staff led by Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir and the newish defense minister, Israel Katz, and this prime minister feeling pretty good about himself. By the way, they just passed a budget early this week, so the Netanyahu government is likely secure for the coming year at least. I do believe that they're going to try to go all the way if Hamas doesn't soften its position and give up hostages. And retaking the entire Gaza Strip, taking away, essentially, going to destroy Hamas, not only as a military force, but also as, the real still governing force in Gaza. Humanitarian aid will be taken away from Hamas. Either the IDF or some other non-Hamas body will be responsible for the aid. We may be even looking at the reestablishment of a military administration over the Gaza Strip, which, as we all remember, was in place for many decades, since the Six-Day War in 1967. Again, we're not there yet. This isn't a fully approved plan, but there are plans to actually go and do this.
Is the demand on Hamas only to release the hostages or also to give up power entirely?
So obviously giving up power is part of it, but I think that's more the big picture negotiation. And I think also from the Israeli point of view, giving up power isn't enough. They want Hamas to lay down its arms, and depending on the day, depending on the official, to leave the Gaza Strip, at least the leadership. Again, you hear this sometimes from the Trump administration, but sometimes the Trump administration just talks about Hamas relinquishing power. I don't think Israel will be satisfied with Hamas just relinquishing power and kind of staying in the background, pulling the strings in the Gaza Strip, armed still with 10,000, 20,000 fighters. At least from Netanyahu's point of view, that's not the outcome he wants. But again, we're not there yet. Right now, like I said, we're going for coercive diplomacy. I think basically, if I read the situation correctly, Netanyahu is trying to shave, quote unquote, as many hostages away from Hamas as possible to kind of whittle down the number, get as many people back as possible. And this is a coercive tool that he thinks, will work. Remains to be seen. Remains to be seen if Hamas caves, because even if they do, right, and even if they say 11 live hostages are released, hopefully, that's half the remaining live hostages, we believe, are still in captivity. And let's say Israel agrees to a month-long ceasefire, a 2-month-long ceasefire through Passover, and maybe a bit beyond. We'll just be having the same conversation in a month or two, Shanie, right? That there won't be a permanent end to the war. Hamas will still have X number of hostages. It'll just be, again, what we talked about earlier, back to the future, deja vu all over again. I think Hamas may understand that is the case, but it's a major decision for them. And barring that, the offensive will increase and expand in Gaza. Now, that's the government position. That's kind of the state of play, as I understand it right now. The criticism of this approach and the strategy is pretty obvious, and you can imagine what it is, Shanie. You can renew the offensive and you can apply pressure on Hamas and you can try to coerce them into caving, but you're putting at risk the 20 plus Israelis still alive in the Gaza Strip, right? And not to mention the 30 plus Israeli hostages who are no longer alive, but you want their bodies to be returned for burial back in their homeland. What happens with the 59 hostages that are still in the Gaza Strip, right? Will the pressure actually make Hamas cave, or will you actually be leading to the death of even more hostages through this approach? And that's the real criticism for many here and for many outside of Israel as well.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of ways to get Hamas out of power, obviously there's the external pressure, but something we don't talk about often is the internal pressure from Gazans themselves. And this week we saw Gazans in the north of the Strip chanting for an end to Hamas, calling for them to step down and demonstrating in the thousands. What is the significance of this sort of move? And I'm wondering why now, after 18 months, we're finally seeing such public displays of opposition.
So I don't know the genesis of why these anti-Hamas demonstrations broke out. Far be it for me to speak for the people of Gaza. I'll say a couple things. Number one, yes, these were fairly remarkable scenes that we've seen now, over the past 3 days inside the Gaza Strip, and not just in the north. It started in Bet Lahia in northern Gaza. It spread a bit to other parts of northern Gaza and Gaza City, but we also saw them in Khan Yunis in the south, in maybe eastern Gaza as well. So they're a bit more widespread. It's still difficult for us, obviously, as journalists looking on from the outside, to get a grip on how widespread the protests are and what the scale of them are. But it's hundreds, if not thousands of people going out in the streets, chanting very openly, demanding Hamas out, right? And the fall of the Hamas regime. They also don't have very nice things to say about Al Jazeera, which is quite interesting, saying, Al Jazeera, why don't you cover our demonstrations against Hamas? The implication being that Al Jazeera only covers kind of pro-Hamas sentiment inside the Gaza Strip and doesn't like to air Gazans criticizing Hamas rule. So that's an interesting wrinkle. And also, obviously, an end to the war. It's also very much kind of, please end this war. And even some reports indicate that protesters inside Gaza are saying, just release the hostages and end this nightmare. So quite remarkable. We should be clear, though, as point number two, there have been anti-Hamas demonstrations in Gaza even before October 7th, even before this war, way back in 2018, maybe even 2017. And you saw anti-Hamas demonstrations mostly due to the very difficult economic and socioeconomic conditions inside Gaza. So there were moments where I think during quite a hot Middle Eastern summer, you had demonstrations against Hamas being like, where's the electricity? Why don't we have electricity here? And things like that. So this is, I dare say, a lot more political, because they're demanding kind of the end of the regime, the fall of the regime, as we've seen across the Middle East over the past, 15 years during the Arab Spring, the same language. And the third thing I'll say is that we haven't seen a real reaction yet from Hamas, right? We haven't seen them actually go and try to disperse these demonstrations like in pre-war days. I think that's because you have Israeli drones and jets in the air, so I think they're scared and they're all underground. It's probably a safe move. And B, they likely understand that they can't push this too far. that, to go back to your original question, I think the people of Gaza at this point, after 18 months of war, have very little to lose, right? You're either going to die because you have no water or food, you may die in an Israeli airstrike, or you may die because some Hamas thugs don't like the fact that you're chanting against them. But the end result, I guess in their minds, probably the same. So you may as well try to go and make your voice heard. Now, again, will that change? Will Hamas actually try to deploy forces and send a message against dissidents and its critics? They have in earlier rounds of the war. They did, right after the ceasefire went into effect in late January and early February. They went after all the people who were, say, in backroom discussions with the Israelis, or people who they thought were in discussions with the Israelis. They went after war profiteers and kind of these more independent-minded clans in the south that were controlling some of the aid flows, and they sent the message to those clans. So again, we're still in early days. We shouldn't kind of predetermine and overdetermine this to be, this is the beginning of the end of Hamas rule in the Gaza Strip. But it is something quite extraordinary. It deserves our support, and it definitely deserves the world's attention, because as many people have been arguing from the beginning, you can be pro-Palestinian, but it doesn't mean that you need to be pro-Hamas.
On that note, I wonder if there's anything that the Israeli side can do to prop up these folks. Do you envision that happening? Because, of course, having internal pressure against Hamas serves Israel's purposes very clearly, since they are also trying to oust Hamas. So is there anything that you can see any way that, Yeah,
the best thing Israel can do is shut up. Keep your mouth shut.
Okay.
And Defense Minister Israel Katz did the opposite yesterday, on Wednesday, and he urged the Gazan people to learn from the people of Bet Lahia and to rise up against Hamas. This is terrible. Definitely don't say anything publicly. And maybe, in the background, obviously there are Israeli forces in the Strip. There are Israeli forces above the Strip. So you can kind of maybe support people quietly, but with a big stick, metaphorically speaking. But definitely don't say anything publicly, because so far Hamas has predictably called these people agents of Israel, agents of the Jews, of the occupation. They've also called them agents of the Palestinian Authority, of Fatah. So basically they're trying to spin this as the conspiracy and an uprising, masterminded by foreign agents, by the foreign powers, Israel and the Palestinian Authority, i.e. a foreign conspiracy. So you don't want that to gain traction. You want this to be what I believe it to be, is an authentic uprising against these gangsters and terrorists who have been literally destroying the Gazan people's lives since they took over the Gaza Strip way back in 2007, right? Just years and years of war and misery and death and destruction for no apparent gain, up to and including the current war, which has literally destroyed the place. And for what purpose, right? So, if I were Israel, and definitely if I were an Israeli official, both political and military, keep your mouth shut.
Okay, well, here's hoping for the success of those internal movements against Hamas.
It would be a great thing. And look, everything is connected to everything, right? Even, the domestic to the war, and the war to the domestic. And it's all just kind of big. I mean, we're in the Holy Land, but I'll call it an unholy mess, trying to figure out what Netanyahu's motivations are. Is it political? Is it military and strategic? What comes first, chicken or the egg? I mean, you can kind of drive yourself crazy trying to figure out what the play is and for what reason, and what does he actually mean versus what he actually says. Usually with Netanyahu, it's all the above, and he's working on kind of multiple different avenues and multiple different planes. I think, the usual answer is all of the above. But I will say the fact that you do see an uprising inside Gaza, however widespread it is and however widespread it may become, is I fear, I'll be careful how I say this, I fear it's bad news for the hostages, because people watch it from the outside, at least for right now, in the coming days, and say, oh, look, our strategy is working. You see, the fact that we renewed the war and we applied more pressure on Hamas, whether military or via aid, this will lead to the collapse of the Hamas regime. And so there's no reason for us to prioritize negotiation and maybe a halt or end to the war to get the hostages back. That's my fear. Now, again, situation may change in a week. Again, things here change literally every 24 hours. But for right now, that's probably the lesson many people at the very top of the Israeli system are drawing from what we're seeing right now in Gaza. And we need to be kind of clear-eyed about that as well. That they think, oh, look, our strategy is succeeding. We're going to kind of remove Hamas from power via more pressure and via popular uprising inside the Strip.
Yeah. Thanks for all that insight, Neri. Hopefully our listeners will be smarter than us as always and will reveal that Hamas has been completely overthrown by tomorrow morning when they hear us.
We can only hope. But again, it can go various ways, right? But we have seen in recent months and in recent years, popular uprisings against cruel dictatorships topple those regimes very quickly. That nobody predicted it, no intelligence agency, no analyst predicted it. And then, in a matter of days or weeks, it happens. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen here in Gaza, but if these protests grow and Hamas can't get a grip on it, and, you start seeing videos of mobs, quote unquote, or massive groups of Gazans going after actual Hamas fighters inside Gaza, then we may be in a new situation. But for right now, we're not quite there yet.
Thanks for the update, Neri. I'll see you next time.
Thank you, Shanie. And if I don't talk to you beforehand, hopefully you have a quiet and healthy and tasty and kosher Passover. Spring has sprung here. I don't know about New York just yet.
No, it has not.
No, it has not. Okay. So hopefully soon, whether it's domestic affairs in Israel or wartime military affairs, I didn't mean it when I say that we have to hope for the best and trust that things will work out, because despair is not an option. Personally, it's not an option in terms of a work plan for all of us that care about what is happening here at the moment. So it is imperative that we stay engaged and, like I said, stay hopeful.